The Consortium of Classical Educators provides resources and regional connections for Christian families, teachers, and educational organizations to expand the reach of classical education and foster human flourishing for generations to come.
So since she mentioned she goes to the church, I preach at about half the time. When Hillsdale was mentioning their thing for pastors and that don't know how to preach, she looked right at me like, I need to go to this. So I'm not sure how to interpret that with that introduction. So whenever I talk about the great books, and I have a class, and I'm teaching a class on like the liberal arts or Western civilization, I always start it the same way. I tell the students, so this first day of class, they're sitting there, they're all nervous, like, what is this? And I tell them, take out a piece of paper and a pen, I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to write down the answer. I'm not going to ask you what you wrote. You don't have to turn this in. In fact, don't turn it in. I'm never going to have you tell anybody what I wrote. And I promise, I will never ask what I wrote, so you might as well be honest in it. And the question I always start with is this: why are you here? So I won't make you take out the piece of paper, but think about that for a second. If you had to do that, like, why are you here? What would you write? And then the reason I ask that, as I say, is the reason I like that question is, well, first of all, what did the question mean? Because it could have meant a couple things, even in this. Like, why are you here right now today, right? I don't know if you've noticed, but it's Saturday. It's a pretty nice day, right? There are a lot of other things you could be doing. I mean, sure, this building's fantastic and all, but you've been inside listening to people talk all day. Like, why would you be here? And then you think, okay, well, maybe part of the reason you're here is because you're involved, you're raising kids or you're teaching. Like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you teaching your kids? Why are you teaching other people's kids? Why are you doing all of that? But it also could mean, like, why are you here on this planet? Like, I mean, is there a reason you're here? Is it just sort of an accident of nature and you happen to be born? Or is there a purpose? Do you have these large things? And by the time you're done with this, you start thinking, wow, this is one little question. I mean, it has all these spin-offs and things like that. And the reason I like starting that way is because it turns out the history of Western civilization, the liberal arts in general, and even the great books, what they are is it's a history of questions. It's not a history of answers. It's a history of questions, and the questions just go on and on, like, who are we, right? Do we have a function or not? Do we have a destiny or not? Do we have free will or not? What is the nature of what makes people happy? Is being happy a goal or not a goal? What is the goal of us? What should we be trying to do? Is our goal simply reproduction, and is that it, or is there something larger for us? And then you start thinking about these questions, and then you start asking, but then wait a minute, we're physical beings. What's the nature of this world we live in? Like, what is matter? Like, what is this stuff out there? How does it work, right? What makes trees grow? Or what makes the universe? I mean, you've seen those pictures lately. Like, what is this universe? It's like stunning to just start thinking about. And then you start realizing, okay, so here we are, we're these people, we're in this universe, but there's more than one person. How do we get along together? Like, how should we organize ourselves? Like, what should we be doing? What makes a good society? What makes a bad society? Are there things we can do to make a good society? Is having a good society the same thing as being a happy person, or are they different things entirely? And these questions, as you think about it, one of the things that happens is, in the modern college-type curriculum, they get divided. We divide that first set of questions about who we are, and we call it the humanities, and then we take a second set of questions about the nature of the world, and we call it the sciences, and we get a third set of questions about how we interact with one another, and we call it the social sciences. And what we all know is at some point in your life, you specialized in one of those sets of questions, and those were it, and then you learn about your little questions, and then you learn about a narrow set of your little questions, and now you've become a specialist, and it's really nice. But the problem is, you actually have all of these questions, right? You're bigger than this, right? You actually have all of these questions. They're all sitting out there. But we get stuck because our educational system, just the very way we think about education, narrows us down all the time. But then on top of that, what do you spend your days thinking about? You spend your days thinking about all sorts of little details here or there, and we forget, oh, wait a minute. There's all these magnificently great questions out there, and we have an entire history of just asking all these questions. Now, this is the 21st century. Why don't we have answers yet? I mean, you think about like all of this time of all these people asking all these questions, and we still don't have answers to all these questions. Why? And it turns out it's because of a quirky thing about Western civilization, what we're all a product of. Western civilization, unique among the world's civilizations, is not the product of a single civilization. There's two completely separate civilizations. One of them, the first one, is centered in Athens. And we call this sort of the Greek tradition. And you look at sort of the Greek tradition, and you can start with Homer. And Homer writes this great book, The Odyssey. And the Odyssey, if you're reading it, is a magnificent book. It's got Odysseus, and he's sailing out on this ocean, and he's fighting all these monsters, Cyclops or so on, and he's brilliant, and he does it. And then he finally gets home, and when he gets home, what happens? His house has all these suitors in it that are trying to get his wife, and he's angry about it, so he makes this elaborate plot to kill all of them, right? There's this grand moment where he reveals himself to all of them, and he says, here I am, I'm home, fight me or flee. And the great thing is he's already barred all the doors so they can't flee. And so then he just massacres all of them, right? And then the old nurse goes up to his wife and says to her, oh, Odysseus, your husband is home. How you would have thrilled to see him covered in the blood and gore of his enemies. And you can imagine how exciting that would be if your husband came home covered in the brains of all the enemies that he's slain today. And it's just this great picture of just, this is heroism. This is what we should be doing. But the story has a really interesting framing device. It starts not with the story of Odysseus, which is what you think when you're going to read the Odyssey. It starts with the story of Telemachus, who is this punk 20-year-old who's sort of wandering around saying, who's my father? I mean, he's just asking this over and over, because it turns out Odysseus left when he was an infant. He's grown up all this time hearing about his great father Odysseus. He's now becoming a man, and he's trying to figure out, who is my father? And ultimately the question is, am I good enough to be my father, right? Everybody says I'm kind of like him, but am I really as good as the great Odysseus? And this spawns a civilization, sort of looking back to the Homeric stories as this is what it is. It's struggle, and we're going to go achieve these things. And then along comes this guy. And he's sort of an interesting guy. He sort of shuffles around in a dirty robe and barefoot. His name is Socrates. And he goes around and he just talks to people. But in one of the dialogues he says, let us proceed in Homeric fashion. Which is sort of a weird thing for a guy in a dirty robe and barefoot to say, oh yes, I'm kind of like these great Homeric heroes. But what Socrates is doing is something ridiculously impressive. He's taking this entire set of Greek virtues, right? All these virtues of all of this outward, you go do all these heroic things. And he's saying, you know what, those are all great, but we need to internalize them. What's the real struggle? The real struggle is to know yourself. The life that is not, if you don't know yourself, it's not even a life worth living, right? The struggle is to learn about yourself, and the way you learn about yourself is reason. We figure it out. We sit down and we think step by step by step, and we figure out who we are by reasoning it all out. And he's suddenly taken all the grand Homeric stories and said all of that struggle against all those enemies out there, well, the enemies were in your own mind, and we've got to defeat all these enemies of your own mind, of sloppy thinking, and we've got to learn all this stuff. And the very worst thing you can do, he says, is become a misologist, a hater of ideas. And if you ever say, oh, I don't want to think about that, you are a misologist. You're just despicable and beneath contempt, because you should be trying to reason out all of this stuff and learn to know yourself. And let's imagine for a second that we were all just a product of Athens. What would we be like? Well, we don't have to guess about it. We know. We'd be Stoics. The Stoics are fascinating. They show up post-Plato. He's writing this all down. And the Stoics, Epictetus has this great book, The Handbook, which is like a short summary of it. And he starts off saying, look, you have to live your life. Well, let's be reasonable about it. What do you do? What's the first distinction when you think about yourself? Well, there's the things you control and the things you don't control. So which one should you worry about? The things you control or the things you don't control? Well, obviously, worrying about the things you control is the right way to do it, because you can't do anything about the things you don't control. And what do you control? You control your thoughts. You control your ideas. You control how you react to things. You can't control the external world, but you can control how you think about the world. And he says it's very personally reasonable. Like, let's imagine you have a jug, he says. And so you're holding this jug, and when you're holding a jug, you should say, this is a jug, because that's what it is. Then when the jug breaks, somebody drops it, you should say, it is in the nature of jugs to break when they're dropped. So this jug has broken when it hit the floor. I want my life and my reason to be in accordance with reality, so I shouldn't be sad about the fact that this jug broke. That's what jugs do when they're dropped on the floor, and so I should just acknowledge the jug broke because that is in the nature of jugs, and I shouldn't be upset about it. And he says, you imagine a boy, there's boys out there, boys are annoying, right? And they're constantly bothering you. And what should you say? You should say, you know what, there's this boy, he's doing annoying things, but it is in the nature of boys to do annoying things. And so I can't control that. So what I should do is keep my own thoughts in accordance with reality. And I see a boy, I should say, that's a boy. Boys do annoying things. That's just what boys do. And I should just proceed along. And then he says, when you're kissing your wife, you should say, my wife is a human, and I am kissing a human. So when she dies, you'll say, it is in the nature of humans to die. My wife was a human, she died. I shouldn't be upset about this. I should just acknowledge that this is sort of what humans do. I don't want my wife to be other than human, and so when she dies, that's the way it is. And whenever I'm telling this story at Mount Holyoke, or talking about this at Mount Holyoke, I instantly find out there's a massive percentage of Mount Holyoke students who are incredibly superstitious, because they instantly start saying, you shouldn't talk about that. You should not be talking about your wife dying, and sort of because then it might happen, right? I mean, this might cause it. And you think about this Stoic idea. And as soon as you start pressing it, you realize, okay, there's a lot about this idea of reasoning things out that makes sense to me. But, I mean, come on, my wife dies, I'm going to be a little upset. And it seems sort of inhuman. I mean, it doesn't seem quite right. Now, why doesn't that seem right to us? Well, it's because we're not Athenian. There was another tradition developing at exactly the same time over in Jerusalem. And it starts with this guy, heroic guy, Moses. And Moses goes up on a mountaintop, and he comes down from it with stone tablets. And stone tablets are great because you can't erase stone tablets, right? It's in stone. And he says, God gave me these rules, and your job is to obey them. And so it says here, do not murder, so you should not murder. And so you think about what Moses is telling everybody, and it shows up fairly clearly in the Pentateuch over and over again. God wants people to be virtuous. He wants them to act the right way. And how do they know the right way? Well, God told them. It's on stone tablets. How do they know God told them? Well, they've never seen God, right? I mean, nobody's seen God. But Moses came along and said, here they are. You need to believe that God gave me these tablets. This is an act of faith. And you need to just believe this, and then you need to go act virtuously. And so you get this code of conduct, and then you imagine the civilization developing, and everybody knows this code of conduct. And then along comes this guy, Jesus, and he's wearing a robe, but his robe in all the pictures is clean, right? I've never seen him in a dirty robe, right? He's always wearing shoes too, right? But Jesus goes around, and what he does is he takes this external code and internalizes it. He says, you've heard it said, you shall not murder. That's great. I like you shall not murder. I'll be honest with all of you, I've never murdered anyone. I mean, I'm feeling very virtuous today. And he says, but you know what? It's just as bad if you're ever angry with someone. And that's a little bit more annoying to me. I'll be honest, right? Because I've been angry, right? There's this great line in the middle of it, like says, if you call your brother Rocca, this is just terrible. And I remember first reading this in high school at some point and thinking, oh, this is great. I got a new insult I can call my brother. And then you read a little bit further down, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I guess I shouldn't use that insult of all the insults, right? And so he says, internally, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery. Piece of cake. Oh, but don't ever lust after anyone. You've heard it said, you should always be telling the truth. Always be telling the truth, not just when you're in court. I mean, so Jesus takes all these virtues and internalizes it all and says, okay, you need to have faith and you need to achieve levels of virtue that exceed what any one of us exceed. As Jesus says in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's a pretty high standard of perfection. You need to be as perfect as God. Good luck, right? And so what would happen if we were just purely from the Jerusalem axis? I mean, if that's who we were. Well, we don't have to guess again. We know exactly what would happen. We would all be hermits living out in the desert somewhere. Because if your whole goal is just don't ever do anything bad, don't ever have bad thoughts or anything, the easiest way to do that, you'll still fail, but the easiest way to do it is to remove yourself from all contact with any other humans. Because humans make you fail all the time. They annoy you, they tempt you, all sorts of sins. You think about how many sins you committed just because you're around other people, right? You get rid of all of those, you go off somewhere, you'd find your hermitage, you just have no TV, nothing, you just sit around, think about God, and try to be virtuous all day. And you think, that doesn't sound right to me either. And the problem is, we're not purely Athenian, and we're not purely from Jerusalem. What happens is these two completely different civilizations, they're developing in isolation from one another, come crashing together in the Roman Empire. And suddenly these two civilizations meet. And what happens through the course of the Roman Empire is people start marrying them and saying, you know what? We like this Athenian tradition. We like this Jerusalem tradition. You know what we should do? We should be both. We should both use reason to find knowledge and find out about ourselves. And we should also have faith to produce virtue. And we really ought to do both. And Augustine writes over and over, lots of Ortas, is just trying to reconcile how can you be both a very good Plato type, how can you be very good in the classical tradition, and how can you be very Jesus-like How can you be very good in the Christian tradition? The classical Christian tradition is exactly this Roman idea that somehow or another we can marry these two things. And so Augustine writes this book, City of God. And what he says is you can look at human history. And human history is like these two levels. It's got the city of man level where we watch all of what we're doing, and it's got the city of God level that we're watching what God's doing. And both of these two things get married together in one history that somehow or another everything we're seeing is both the product of man and the product of God. And somehow or another, all the things are happening because God wants them to, and all the things are happening because sinful humans are doing them, and somehow or another this all works out, and we know this all fits together, but how? And then 1,000 years later, well, not quite 1,000 years later, Aquinas sits down and he writes this massive work, the Summa Theologica. And in the Summa Theologica, what he tries to do is this. He says, okay, we got these two pillars of things we know. We've got the philosopher, who's Aristotle. And if Aristotle wrote it, it's true. And we've got the Bible, and if it's in the Bible, it's true. And so then how do we take Aristotle and the Bible and show that they never contradict one another? As somebody once put it, Aquinas was trying to write a single constitution for the city of God and the city of man, to put these two things together, that they would reconcile each other, that somehow or another we can both perfect our reason and learn knowledge, and perfect our faith and learn virtue, and maybe we can somehow make this all work out. And then the most beautiful expression of it comes with Dante in this just wildly imaginative work of sort of imagining, he takes this road trip through hell into purgatory into heaven, and he's telling this story, and it works in everything from the Greeks and everything from Jerusalem, and it's all there in one grand narrative. And the Renaissance kicks off, and the Renaissance is this magnificent flowering of attempts to put together Athens and Jerusalem, and how we can have all of this magnificent art and all of this magnificent thought and all of these things together, and it hits its summit. I mean, the pinnacle of the Renaissance comes in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet is standing there in the middle of the play, and he says, "What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me." And the Renaissance dies. I mean, suddenly what happens in Hamlet is we get the grandest expression of how amazing we all are, and it all comes crashing down around him. And why? Well, the story begins, as you all know, Hamlet's father, the ghost, shows up and tells Hamlet, "You know what? I got murdered by your uncle who stole my throne and married your mom, and he's stealing the throne." And this is a bad thing, right? And then the ghost looks at Hamlet and says, "If thou hast nature in you, let not this stand." Like, do something about it. And it's not hard to think, what are you supposed to do? When your uncle murders your father and marries your mother and steals the throne, and you now know this is true, what do? Well, you embrace your inner Odysseus. You go murder the guy, right? I mean, that is the only proper response, is take action and avenge the father. We know you have to avenge the father. Hamlet's standing there like, "Telemachus, am I good enough?" And it's obvious what he has to do to be good enough. But then the ghost says, "Howsoever you do this, taint not your mind." So here's your problem. Go murder your uncle. But whatever you do, don't ever be a little bit angry about it. Have like zero anger, just sort of dispassionately do it. Don't ever think an impure thought as you're slaughtering this guy. And Hamlet is stuck. And he's completely stuck of, am I supposed to follow the Athenian tradition and do the reasonable and natural and normal? And I mean, we all agree that's the right thing to do. Or am I supposed to follow the Jerusalem tradition and turn the other cheek and keep my soul pure all the time? And he can't solve this. And in the grand speech that we all know, he says, to be or not to be. To be or not to be what? Like, what is he wondering about? He says, to be or not to be, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So who do we know of that stands suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and never says a word in his defense, just suffers entirely in his own mind and quietly goes to his death? Jesus does this. So whether 'tis nobler to do that or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Who did that? Who goes out into an ocean full of trouble and using his might ends trouble after trouble after trouble? Odysseus. To be Jesus or not to be Jesus? To be Odysseus or not to be Odysseus? And he can never figure this out. And the result is everyone dies. I mean, they all get slaughtered. It is a massacre in the hall. And then in Shakespeare, just pure genius, the Stoic of the play, Horatio, breaks down in tears. He cries when Hamlet dies. And he's the Stoic. And we realize then, by the end of Hamlet, this entire attempt to just pretend we can marry these things with no problems crashes on the Hamlet problem. What was Hamlet supposed to do in this situation? Good, I mean, you can have a fabulous discussion like, well, what should he have done? Should he have killed the uncle? Should he turn the other cheek? I mean, what should you do when you get this challenge? And we have no answer. We still have no answer. And the play is just a bloody mess by the end. And then we're into sort of this problem of like, you imagine you've built this whole civilization on we're going to marry these things. And it comes crashing around as people are going to realize, I don't know how to reconcile this. And shortly after Shakespeare's life, the 30 Years' War starts in Europe. The 30 Years' War makes any war you think of look like nothing. I mean, this is like multiple armies rampage against you. Germany gets depopulated, not just the armies, but like whole towns just vanish from the map with just the mass slaughter going on for 30 years. Now, you think about the most recent war, the Ukraine war. After 3 days, people were like, man, this war's been going on forever. I cannot even understand. Like, I know the Russians must have lost by now, right? I mean, imagine 30 years. Think about yourself 30 years ago. And imagine you were living in a society that there wasn't just some war somewhere else, but your town had been the site of pitched battles for the last 30 years. And the town next door, everyone was killed. I mean, this is just a massacre. And so then what happens? People start saying, how do we build this civilization? And we see this problem. We've got Athens and we've got Jerusalem, and how do we marry them? And then along comes the Enlightenment. Descartes kicks it off, and he says, you know what we got to do? We got to start all over. I think, therefore I am. And I'm going to reason out everything. You sort of see the tilt. Like, maybe we should just think more about Athens. And the Enlightenment develops, and lots of thinkers start reasoning everything out, and it all comes crashing to an end in the Enlightened Revolution in France, where they had invented the enlightened means of killing people. That old nasty way of hanging them was brutal. Let's just chop off their heads with a guillotine. And somehow the blood of the guillotine is perfectly reasonable and rational, and then everybody starts saying, wait a minute, maybe this whole reasoning things out isn't working so well. So the Romantic era is born, and suddenly you get all these poets, and they start writing about nature, and sort of all these things out there, and there's this sublime senses out there, and it's just all so amazing, and it's all hidden in the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and in the sky, and it's just this magnificent stories, and then, eventually, you start seeing the Thoreau, like, let's just go out to the woods and find ourselves. And Emerson starts writing about, nobody knows what Emerson's even writing about. And I mean, you just sort of get this magnificent, like, we just got to go figure out this deep thing underlying everything. You realize, oh, this is like the tilt to Jerusalem. There's something deeper than reason. And then along comes Dickens, and he says, you fools, there are starving people on the street. There are prostitutes being beat to death by really terrible people, and you're just off there with all your flights of fancy. And then Darwin comes along and says, you know what? You're an animal, right? I mean, I know you're thinking all these lofty thoughts about yourself, but you are a mammal. Don't forget this. You're just a physical mammal, right? And then Henry James writes novels of exquisite precision, where everything is perfectly worked out. Every sentence is perfectly crafted. Every action is perfectly explained. And you start getting, we call this realism. Like, now we know what really is going on. And you're like, what are we doing here? And then by the late 1900s, Nietzsche stands up and looks out at this civilization and says, you guys, what are you doing? You're sitting around, you're talking about all these lofty things. Have you not realized God is dead? And Christians hear that all the time, think, oh, Nietzsche, he said. But the funny thing is, he was right. If you look at Western civilization in the late 1900s, God is off the scenes. He's just nowhere there. Nietzsche turns out to be saying exactly what the Apostle Paul says. If you have a society that's removed God from it, what do you have? You just have a lot of people exercising a will to power and fighting all these gory, bloody battles over all sorts of things, and this civilization has just lost its moorings. And Nietzsche would have been a great challenge all by himself. Because his books they're fun to read. I mean, they're brilliant because he's so crazy. He's just wandering all over and so on. But then shortly after he writes, Einstein comes along and says, you want to know something really interesting? You want to know what's permanent? The speed of light. That's a constant. Time is not. If you travel faster, time moves at a different speed than if you travel slower. Imagine that for a second. Imagine you have lived for thousands of years thinking time is this thing that we can measure. We all know what an hour is, right? I mean, we all know what an hour is. Oh, but you don't know what an hour is because an hour depends upon your frame of reference and how quickly you're moving through space. And two people moving at different speeds, send somebody up in the rocket ship and they land back on Earth, they travel really fast, and when they land, their watch will be at a different time than your watch, and that turns out to be a physical fact of the world that time is relative. And the shock waves of that are stunning on people. Like, what can I rely on? If I can't rely on an hour means an hour, what am I supposed to rely on? And then Freud comes along at exactly the same moment and says, you think you know what you're thinking? You have an unconscious mind that's doing thinking that you don't even know about because it's unconscious. And your brain is doing, right now, your unconscious mind is having thoughts that your conscious mind is unaware of. You don't even know yourself here. And then Joyce writes books that destroy the novel, right? He writes Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which is the beginning. But Ulysses is a stream of consciousness novel that you could spend the rest of your life trying to put together what's going on in this book, and that is a big challenge. And then he follows it up with Finnegan's Wake, which if you've never opened it, you should. And just open it, right? Read any random paragraph. The entire book is a stream of unconsciousness. It is a 1,000-page book or something, right, that is entirely a stream of unconscious thought. It's unreadable, and yet it is all coherent and put together, and people spend forever figuring out all the puns and all the ways. I mean, it's magnificent that way, but you can't read this thing. Stravinsky comes along and writes music, The Rite of Spring, that so destroys music it causes a riot in the streets of Paris. So imagine you go to a classical music concert and you're sitting there, and when you leave you start breaking windows because you are just so outraged by this complete destruction of music. And you all can't imagine it because you've all heard modern music, right? But imagine this is the first time you're hearing anybody that breaks the scale. And then T.S. Eliot comes along and says, you're all living in a wasteland. Western civilization has just died, and all we have now are all these remnants and pieces that we have to try to somehow knit back together. And somehow or another, we're going to put it all together again. And this civilization has just died, and we have spent the last 100 years trying to figure out how to knit back together Western civilization. And that's been our challenge. So whenever we're talking about all the recent moves and all the things that are going on right now, all they are people trying to figure out how do we resuscitate this thing? How do we put together Athens and Jerusalem again? How can we do this in a way that will give us a coherent way to organize ourselves and answer these questions? And we have a really hard time doing it. But then the problem compounds when we think about education. Education also suffers a massive problem in the early 20th century. If you go back in time, so you go back to Dante. Dante is the last person that is said, there's no way to measure it, but the last person who is said to have known everything there is to know. And it's entirely possible Dante did know everything there was to know. It is entirely possible he had read all the important books that had ever been written, because there's a lot of them, but they're not infinite, and a lot of them have been lost and just didn't exist at the time. So it's possible he literally knew everything. But after that, it's hard to know everything, right? I mean, it gets hard to know everything. But even by the mid-1800s, you go to the mid-1800s, it was possible to imagine there's this common set of questions that we're all asking, and there's this whole set of answers that we're wrestling with through the Enlightenment, through the Romantic era, and the Realism era. Everybody's arguing about the same things. And you go back in those times and you can read those books. You can pick up the latest book in anything and you can read it and you can argue with your friends about it. And we've got this idea that that's what you would do in the high schools and college, is you learn about all these liberal arts, all these questions, and you get this grand view of knowledge and you see all the parts of it, right? You're seeing all the parts of it. But then a funny thing happens at the beginning of the 20th century. And what happens at the beginning of the 20th century, you can see it with Einstein. You look at all these major figures, all of these writers I've talked about. And up until Einstein, you could go back and read the originals. You could sit down this afternoon and pick up any of these authors, sit down and read it. Just you right now. You cannot sit down and read Einstein's articles explaining the general theory of relativity. You have no hope of doing that unless you have spent years in studying theoretical physics. And that happens in discipline after discipline after discipline. Happens in economics. You can read any of the 19th century books in economics. Mill, you can read them. You can read Ricardo. You can read Smith. I mean, you can read any of these guys, and they're really interesting and fun. But if you were to go pick up the latest copy of the American Economic Review, unless you spent a lot of time studying economics, you have no hope of reading it. The same is true in biology, the same is true in astronomy, and the same is true in just discipline after discipline after discipline. These disciplines have gotten so developed and so hyper-specific, they are no longer available to the commonly educated person. You just can't go read this stuff. So what happens? And the move happens in the early 20th century at Harvard. The president of Harvard at the time, Charles Eliot, realizes what's going on, that knowledge is specializing, and if you're going to go to college and you want to go off to be an engineer or an economist or whatever, right, you've got to spend a lot of time studying this. So he abolishes the common curriculum at Harvard and introduces the elective system. And suddenly for the first time you could go to Harvard and you got to choose what you wanted to take. You didn't just have to take all the required courses. And so you get to pick, I wanted to learn this subject or this subject. But then Eliot, you know, he's a smart guy, and he realizes this is a problem, right, if we're going to have all these specialists. So he's out giving a talk to sort of a workman's group. And he says, you know what, you're not in college, right? So he's not talking to a college audience. He says, you know what you could do, though? You still can learn all of the great Western civilization, all these ideas of the liberal arts, if you have a 5-foot shelf of books. And he really emphasizes the 5-foot shelf of books. All you need are 5 feet worth of books, and you can have all the major works and all these major traditions, and you can think through all of these things by reading these books. And then Harvard Classics is born, which puts out a 5-foot shelf of books that you can buy, and it's got everything you would need to read in it to become a liberally educated person. And then Hutchins at Chicago and Mortimer Adler take this idea and run with it like no tomorrow. And they invent the great books curriculums. Chicago gets a great books required course. Columbia gets a required course in it. St. John's University starts all the great books. They too put out a great books thing. This is the Encyclopedia Great Books of the Western World, right? If you've ever seen them, they have got to be the worst books, I mean physical books ever. I mean the typeset is awful. They didn't care at all about translations. They just slapped in the old translator. They're terrible. But here was the virtue of it. You could get a door-to-door salesman that would come sell you Western civilization. And here's the best part. It's 62 inches of books. It's 2 inches better than that Harvard Classics, right? And so they have this idea that this is what you do. And this is where the idea of the great books are born. Before that, nobody talked about the great books. But the great books are born in this idea that we know you're not getting a liberal education anywhere in your school, but at least you can go read all of these books. This creates another crisis, though. I mean, this is history of Western civ, right? Creates another crisis. The crisis is this. Once this great books momentum starts, and so through the 50s into the 60s, and then people start reacting to it, and there's like this pair of twin errors. The first error is this. People come along and say, what makes these books so great? These are all dead people who wrote it. They're all in the past. These are just useless. We shouldn't bother reading the old books. And I'll spend no time talking about that because let's be honest, if you're here at a classical education conference, you know that's wrong. So you know, in different times we can talk about that. But the other error is this. We got these great books, and people began to fetishize them. They turned them into idols. And then you got these idols of the great books. And then when you approach the great book, you're on holy ground. And so if you're coming on holy ground to the great book, you certainly need to take off your shoes, probably on your knees as you approach the great book that is just there, and I need to reverence this great book. And then once you go down that route of thinking, oh, the great books, and they're just the man, then you begin to realize the great book pantheon of gods, they're not all the same, right? There are the good gods and the bad gods. And which gods are you supposed to worship in the pantheon? Obviously the good gods. And so reading Locke, that's good. But Rousseau, I mean, that's fine. And if you go to Marx, I mean, you might as well be a Satan worshiper, right? I mean, you certainly want to read those guys, right? Richard Wright, he seems a little angry. Maybe you ought to stay away. Freud, he talks a lot about sex. And, I'm not sure that's something we should really be talking about. And so what happens is you see people talking about the great books all the time and how important it is to read them. And what they mean when you start pressing it is, oh, I don't want you reading all the great books. Just the ones I agree with. Just the ones that validate my worldview. And I'm not reading them to answer all these questions. I'm reading them to say, oh, I know I'm right, because look, Locke said it. And then somebody else says, well, Rousseau said something different. Oh, Rousseau is evil. I mean, obviously we don't want to. And suddenly you realize that's not talking about the great books. It's not the liberal arts tradition at all.
So what do we do? Well, we need some other way to think about these, and it's that the great books are not there to be fetishized or ignored. They're there to point us to something else. They're there to point us to this idea that you have all these questions, that you're wrestling with all these ideas, and these books are there wrestling with all these questions and ideas, and you read them because they make you think about things. You can violently disagree with Marx, but you should still read Marx because when you read him, you think, why is he wrong? Like, where is the mistake in him? You should read Richard Wright. Nana's Son is an amazing novel if you've never read it. It is a very angry novel. Why is he so angry? Is he right to be so angry, right? And you read these books because they're making you think about all of this stuff. And the problem you run into when you start talking about the great books like this is this really interesting problem in the modern age. The problem comes, and it's perfectly described in this essay by Albert J. Nock in the early 20th century. The title of the essay is Isaiah's Job. And Nock begins the essay by retelling the story of Isaiah. And he tells it this way. He says, okay, so God comes to Isaiah. He says, I got a job for you. I want you to go out into the world, and I want you to tell them what's true. And I want you to just give it to them straight. This is what the problem is. This is what you should do. But in doing this, don't make any mistake. They aren't going to listen to you. In fact, they're really not going to like hearing what you have to say, right? Because, they're just there. If you're lucky, you'll escape with your life. And Isaiah looks at God and says, you know what? I'm okay with this mission thing, but what's the point? Like, what's the point in going out and preaching and giving a real story if nobody's going to listen to me anyway? Like, why would we bother talking about this if nobody's going to listen? And God looks at Isaiah and he says, oh, you missed the point. There's a remnant out there. There's a small group of people out there that are still looking for me. And when you're out there preaching, you're preaching to the remnant so that they will hear somebody saying this stuff and they won't feel all alone. And the importance of the remnant is this. They're scattered, they're small, but when the civilization collapses and somebody needs to rebuild it, the remnant are there to do that. That's our job with the great books. Our job is to say, yes, the discussion, you mentioned the great books on a college campus, and it is like instant explosion of what are you talking about? You mentioned other circles, and it is this venerated. Our job is to remind people we read these books because they help us think through all of these really important questions. That's why we read them. We read them because they're magnificent conversation partners. And we've got this really interesting problem. We say that, and I know you all agree with this. I mean, it wouldn't be here if you didn't think the great books are good. But here's the problem we run into. There's one step we all have to take if we're ever going to have any hope of convincing anybody of this. Without this, nothing you say will matter. And the problem is, we often want to just skip the step because it's hard, right? And the step is this: you have to be a role model. If you're saying reading the great books is so important, well, you know what you better be doing? It's not that complicated. And then we start thinking about this problem of how do you be a role model? And we begin to realize, oh, I know why I'm not. And it comes from this exercise. Look at the person on your left. This is the audience participation portion of the program, right? Look at the person on your left. Now look at the person on your right. 100 years from now, both those people will be dead. Don't laugh. 2 people looked at you. Every one of your students or kids will be dead in 100 years. And yet we go through life spending our days thinking about what? Things that are here today and gone tomorrow. We spend our lives thinking about things that do not matter. 100 years from now, nobody will care what you do tomorrow. Nobody will even know what you do tomorrow, right? We spend our time obsessed with all of these minute details of our lives instead of spending our time thinking about things that are eternal, things that will still matter in 100 years. And you know what? We tell our students this all the time. They're in school, and why are they in high school? They're in high school in order to get into college. And why are they in college? They're in college in order to get a major. And why do they need a major? They need a major in order to get a job, right? Most common question. You've all asked this, right? You're talking to a college student, you say, what's your major? First question, and they tell you whatever. Second question, what are you going to do with that? That's always what we ask. What are you going to do with this education, right? Like, what's the use value of all this stuff you're learning? And here's the funny secret. Students are not walking jobs. But here's the other part. You are not a walking job. You are a complete multi-dimensional person, created in the image of God himself. You're endowed with the full measure of humanity. All of it is embodied in you. And you have all these questions. You have all these things that you haven't quite sorted out about how do I lead a good life? How should I build a society? How should I do it? And you're wrestling with all these issues. And you constantly, just like our students do, reduce it down and allow you to put in a box. I am my job, right? I am this person. I'm a husband, or I'm a wife, or I'm this person that does this or something. And we just reduce, and we're just constantly putting ourselves in the boxes instead of letting us, you know what? Just because you were an English major, just because you studied English doesn't mean you shouldn't stare at those trees out there and think, how did that happen? Like, how literally does that little seed turn into one of those things? It's amazing. Just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you shouldn't be sitting down reading a novel thinking, wow, humanity is so complicated and amazing. Just because you're an economist doesn't mean you shouldn't spend time thinking about what laughter is all about. And like, why do we laugh, right? And so you imagine all of these questions. Inside every one of you is the soul of a poet. And inside every one of you is the soul of a scientist. And they are both screaming to get out. Both of them. Let them out. Let them have some air. Let them breathe. As Hamlet said, sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fasten us unused. You have a godlike intellect. Godlike, created in the image of God. You can think about the future and the past. You should do so. You should be thinking about the future and the past and the meaning. And you want to know something amazing? As you're thinking about all these great questions, you have all of these conversation partners sitting there waiting to have them with you. And they're the authors of the great books. Read the great books. Read the Gospel of John and the book of Genesis, but also read Homer and Dante and Shakespeare. Read Freud, read Darwin, read Locke and Rousseau, read just all of these. Because what you find when you're reading them is they have also been asking the same questions you're asking, and they're struggling with them. And you read them and you think, wow, is this answer the right answer, or is it not? Is this answer semi-right or not? And you do this book by book by book, just struggling with them all, realizing you're having each book talk to you. You sit down with Darwin and you say, am I really just a glorified rat? You sit down with Ellison and you say, am I really invisible? You sit down with Augustine and you say, am I really loved by God? You sit down with Austin and say, am I really in love? And as you're reading these books, book after book, this is my promise. You will notice your world expanding, and these books will become your constant companions. They will be there on those days that are just sort of depressing and sad, and they'll be there saying, yeah, I get it. They'll be there on those soul-crushing days when work was just more dismal, your kids were just completely misbehaving, and they're there. They're also there when your first kid is born and you think life can't get any better than this. They're there through all of this. And you pick them up one after another, and you let each one talk to you. And you think about it, you ponder it, you laugh with it, you throw it across the room in disgust. It makes no difference, because all you're doing book by book by book is saying, what answer do I have to these questions? And you know what? Your answer to the questions is the one that matters. And it's the one that matters because it's your answer to the question. And if you want to work out how this world works, this is what you do. You think through these things. You dwell on these things. You struggle with these things. And so here's your homework assignment. And I know you didn't expect a homework assignment, but I'm a college professor, right? Here's your homework assignment. Sometime in the next week, sit down and make a list of 6 books. 6 books you've heard about, 6 books that are great, that you've always heard about but you've never read, that you think might have something to say to you. Make that list of 6 books and promise yourself this. In the next year, you will read all 6 of those books. 1 year, 6 books. That's 1 book every 2 months, let's be clear. And I don't care how busy you are. If you pick a 300-page book, reading it in 2 months is 5 pages a day. You have time to read 5 pages a day of a book that you think might help you wrestle with a question. It may have a wrong answer, it may have a right answer, it doesn't matter if it helps you think through the question. Make that list of 6 books and just read all 6 of them in the next year. That's what being a role model is. It turns out, you see people all the time telling students, yeah, you should be reading all these great books, it's great. And you tell your friend, oh, you should be reading the great books. And if they look at you, they realize you're a complete fraud because you don't do this. Like, do you read the great? Now, we all read them when we have to assign them in a class. We all do that, right? But what about just reading them because it might have something to say to me? And you know what? Everybody out there can tell if you're talking about the great books, but you aren't making a practice of just picking up book after book after book and reading them one by one by one, just to see what you get out of it. Not worrying what you get out of it, just reading it for the pure enjoyment of it. And remember, you're picking the 6 books you think you might most like to read, and you're reading them one after another after another. If you're not doing that, there is no way to spread this idea that this is important. And there's not only will your students notice, and your friends notice if you aren't doing it, God also cares. Paul, in the letter to the Corinthians, says to us, you have the mind of Christ. And if you think about this idea of the mind of Christ, and what he means by that is this. When we have the mind of Christ, we can understand both spiritual things and the things of the natural world. The people without the mind of Christ can only understand the natural world, but you have the mind of Christ. And the mind of Christ allows you to look out at this vast array of things and think through all of it with the Holy Spirit as a guide and Christ sitting there as your conversation partner without all. You have the mind of Christ. Use it. Go forth and read. Let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you that you gave us the mind of Christ. And God, we thank you that you've put us in a place where we are surrounded by a wealth of literature, God, of people that are wrestling with all these ideas of what it means to be human and how we should live our lives. God, give us the impetus to wrestle with these questions ourselves. Give us the impetus, God, to take seriously this idea that you want us to be philosophers, that you want us to be lovers of wisdom. And God, give us the faith to know that whatever is true always comes back to you, that we don't need to be afraid of thinking through ideas because we know in the end there is a truth and it's found in you. But God, teach us to use our minds. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. And so in closing, if we can all... So I think people that really need to thank are Sarah, Tim, and Heather Lee for just arranging this. This has been phenomenal. There is something stunning when you think about the 3 of them. I mean, how much time went into organizing something like this, and let's be honest, how seamless the day is. Days like this don't happen. I've been to lots of bad events, so have you all, right? This one went seamlessly, and that is purely people doing a ton of work behind the scenes to make sure it works. So thank you to all 3 of you for just a marvelous thing. Thanks for all coming here today and talking about the great books and all these great things, and have a wonderful evening and rest of the weekend.